Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm very excited today to welcome Gary Haugen as our guest on Conversing. Gary is the founder and CEO of International Justice Mission. This is a mission that's committed to a response to violence against women and children, in particular, human trafficking, the building of public justice systems. It's now been in existence for 28 years. Before its founding in 1997, Gary was a human rights attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he focused primarily on crimes of police misconduct. In 1994, he became the director of the United Nations investigation in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. He's been in this role as CEO and leader of IJM for its entire life. It's a team of lawyers, criminal prosecutors, law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and many people of social service that care deeply out of their own Christian faith in bringing functioning public justice systems and protection and rescue to people all around the world. Gary, welcome back to Conversing. It's such a gift to have you here.
Delighted to be with you.
You know, IJM, International Justice Mission, started 28 years ago. And in that period of time, absolutely extraordinary things have happened. And I wanted to have you on as a guest in part to simply bring us up to speed on what the International Justice Mission is doing today. But in order to set the stage for people who may not be acquainted with IJM, I want to go back and have you give us a recap, as it were, of the first, let's say, 25 years. And then we'll zero in on what's happening currently. So sketch that background for us. Such a remarkable thing.
Sure. Well, IJM came into being substantially as a way to try to address the problem of violence against the poor. I grew up in a Christian and mission context of my friends and my churches going out, the churches that I attended, were definitely supporting ministries that were serving in very poor communities around the world. And they were addressing the need for church planting and evangelism. They're meeting the needs of hunger and disease and lack of fresh water or sanitation and housing. But what some of my own personal experience had manifested is that there wasn't a response to the problem of violence against the poor. And this was manifest to me so very powerfully when I went to Rwanda in 1994 as the director of the UN's genocide investigation. And that was sort of the catastrophic demonstration of the way violence destroys everything. But then I saw it in very particular examples around the world, very personally, because Jan, my wife, and I had friends who were working in the Philippines with street kids. They were providing shelter and gospel outreach and care. But then they started to notice some of the teenage girls weren't showing up to the program anymore, and they had found out that they'd been abducted into a brothel in Manila where they're just being serially raped. And then my friends are asking, well, what are we supposed to do about Rosa and Maria? Are we supposed to stop thinking about them? Or are we supposed to take on what they found out was that the Manila police were running that brothel? Or I was visiting a ministry that had thousands of sponsored children in poverty that they were caring for in South Asia. And the director was explaining to me that thousands of the children were actually held in slavery, rolling cigarettes 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, because they had been sold into slavery. Or a doctor in Peru who was working in a small town of 70,000 people, but he had seen 50 cases of rape in 5 days of girls 14 and under. So this was the problem of violence against the poor, not the hunger, not the disease, not the lack of shelter. And so IJM was born with just this idea, well, there should be a witness of God's love for those people and the bringing to bear of special expertise. And I came from a law enforcement and prosecution justice system background. And the idea was maybe we can bring the love of Christ to the people who are in these very brutal situations. So the first 10 years of IJM, Mark, you will know, was just spent developing these small teams of criminal investigators and lawyers and social workers. And we would just take on these individual cases. We'd get those girls out of that brothel. We'd get the kids out of those places of slavery rolling cigarettes. We'd get those girls who were in places where they were being sexually assaulted with regularity to safe places. And we'd work with the local authorities to try to actually prosecute the criminals who are committing those abuses, because if you don't do that, they'll just keep doing it over and over again. And also then developing partners who could provide long-term aftercare for the survivors of that abuse. And so the first 10 years, Mark, was just what we might call IJM 1.0, where we were working individual cases. Now, as you can imagine, if you do that for a decade, you start to try to think, wow, what would it be like to maybe have this stop happening to begin with? In other words, we'd all prefer that no one was abused by this violence to begin with. And so IJM 2.0, another decade, was spent experimenting. I wonder if it's possible to transform or strengthen that local justice system so that it actually enforces the law on its own and it actually provides services to survivors on its own. Right. So that was the second decade. I remember this sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. preached at Riverside Church, where he was talking about the story of the Good Samaritan. He was explaining about his own work was that, the initial act of love by the Good Samaritan is to rescue that individual who's laying beaten along the road. But he said that should be just our initial act. What we should also be looking to do is to transform the whole Jericho Road, so that vulnerable people are not beaten and abused along that roadside in their daily life. And so that was what IJM sought out to do in the second decade, was to see, can our local teams work with the authorities to actually strengthen the justice system so this kind of abuse and violence just doesn't happen in the first place.
I just want to say, for listeners' sake, that I want to own the fact that I've known Gary and been connected to IJM in a significant way from its earliest years, and currently serve on the board. So I'm coming to this conversation with that context and joy and commitment. But I also am coming as a parallel narrator to say that during this period of time, one of the things that was so extraordinary was the amount of genuine learning that had to go on all during this time, because while there were all kinds of evidences of the crying need for what IJM was hoping to do, both on the individual cases and ultimately on the more systemic cases, but it was also the case that there was just so much that had to be figured out along the way. And I think one of the gifts of IJM has been your own, Gary, and other people's capacities for just genuinely diving into the deepest and darkest places and trying to learn what's really actually happening and how do these things, either the individual cases or the governmental public justice system questions, actually break down. Why do they fall apart as they do? And what would it take for them to be strengthened to do the work that you're trying to describe? So it's been a very fascinating and just also a spiritually stunning experience to walk this. It's articulately expressed by your brief summary, but I just want to underscore for you, and I know you feel the same way, this is like a breathtaking exercise, this thing called IJM. And what is going on is stunning. So let's carry on with the story, but I just want to pause on that. There was this amazing conference at the 20-year point called Liberate, which was a gathering of about 5,000 people who came from all over everywhere, who had had some kind of connection to IJM, to celebrate the wonder, the mystery, the gift, the causes of joy, and just deep thanksgiving that God had helped to provide ways through this extraordinarily needy and thick crisis. And then afterwards, I know there was the gathering of all of IJM staff everywhere in the world, which was, how many was it? It was...
There were about 1,000 IJM staff who gathered.
Yeah.
I think more than a third of them had never been outside their country. Maybe 20% of them had never been on an airplane before. So to gather them all together for that celebration of what God had done over 20 years was amazing. And I would commend exactly what you said, the really very courageous learning that the staff participated in, first of all, by doing the casework, because that was a situation where you would have to learn very specifically, well, how are we going to try to infiltrate a place where these kinds of abuses are taking place? How do you get the facts? How do you actually provide care over a long term for people who've been terribly traumatized? But what there also was, Mark, was the bringing to bear of relevant expertise and experience that was in the body of Christ.
Yes.
In the same way of, I couldn't do any of the things that the doctors were doing in Peru, or that amazing ministry group that was working with street children in the Philippines. But my background, or the background of others in law enforcement, criminal investigation, trauma social work, they actually had really abundant expertise, which still needed to go through a tremendous learning process and application, case by case. But it was also this very beautiful story, Mark, of skills and gifts within the body of Christ that were substantially on the sidelines, that didn't have a vehicle for ministry. And IJM helped just provide that vehicle in what turned out to be a really joyful and powerful way.
I think another part of this that needs to be explored, and I'd like you to say more about this, is the way that IJM sees itself fundamentally as an exercise in spiritual formation, which in IJM's case is done through the doing of justice. Tell us how those things hang together and why they are so primary in IJM's identity.
Yeah, I think at the beginning, IJM was formed explicitly as a Christian entity, because very simply, it was a startup, and I'd had two experiences. One in South Africa with church leaders like Bishop Tutu, who were seeking justice, but they were doing it within a community of prayer and of seeking Christ. And I had exposure to that, and I was utterly transformed and empowered and inspired by that as a young person. Then I had other experiences in secular settings where people were doing amazing work of justice, whether it's with the UN, or it was with the US Department of Justice, or some other international human rights organizations. And what I missed, though, was that community of prayer. And so when IJM started, I'm like, well, we're starting it, so why not do it as a community of prayer and Christian faith? But then very quickly, we saw that, what is foundational for actually being able to do the work of justice is the formation of our own character. So we wanted to make it really clear to everybody, when you join IJM, you are going to join first a community of Christian spiritual formation where our first commitment to each other is to encourage one another through rhythms of spiritual formation, various spiritual disciplines, helping each other become more like Jesus. And as part of that, we're going to be doing the discipline of service of seeking justice and pursuing a work of justice in the world. But definitely the foundation was, let's build a community of Christian spiritual formation. And then in the strength of that, let's do a particular task of mission in the world, which is trying to address violence against the poor.
Right. Amazing. And this rhythm, again, for people who are not acquainted with IJM, just give us a sketch of what that rhythm looks like, because it really does permeate IJM in a very profound way.
Well, it's amazing in its simplicity, Mark. And I can remember early on conversations with you about, hey, shouldn't we be doing more? And you're like, nope, just do what you're doing, because what you're doing is fairly revolutionary. And most of the rhythms are simply constituted by a commitment that the first 30 minutes of work are spent in solitude and silence. So everybody begins the day with spiritual preparation of the interior, prayerfully with God. Then we generally work for 2 hours, and then we'll take time out for another half hour of corporate prayer, where we will share with each other things they're grateful for, things where we need God's help. We'll read from the Psalter. We'll pray for the things that have been named, and boom, we go back to work. Then every quarter, we take a whole day off just for a time of prayer retreat. So it is mostly just those simple rhythms of you begin every day in solitude and silence and reflection and preparation of the interior with God. You work hard, but before the idol of work begins to completely swallow you up, you step away from it to again reconnect, to talk to God about what it is you're doing together, and then give a whole day to that sort of engagement with God. And depending on the day, it's just completely irritating to have to begin the workday with solitude and silence. IJMers are all about stopping a horrific injustice in the world on a terribly urgent basis, and we want to bring to bear all of our strength and capabilities. So the idea you got to stop your work just at 11 o'clock when you're starting to get good, just so you can then join everyone else for prayer. These are disciplines. They're things you do each day, whether you feel it or not. But I think most people at IJM would say the most transformative thing about their experience has been the simple rhythms and the life in a community of Christian spiritual formation is what keeps them there.
It's really like a kind of spiritual order that
indeed
brings order to everything else. Yeah, it's a remarkable thing. So let's jump to then the 20-year point, because from 20 to 28 years now, a great deal of further advance has occurred, and it's sped up, it's scaled in very significant ways. There's all kinds of things that have happened, even just in the last 5 years. So let's bring us up to speed on that.
Yeah. So what happened in IJM 2.0, the second decade, is we experimented with this idea of, could our local justice teams in Cambodia or the Philippines or South Asia or wherever, could they actually take all that they're learning from working all these thousands of cases to actually strengthen the justice system, so it was just doing two simple things and doing them in ways you could measure, that the justice system was enforcing the laws and they were actually providing services to survivors that were excellent. And would that result in less of the violence, less of the slavery, less of the sexual violence against women and girls? And the miracle, Mark, that was totally unexpected is that we tried this in 9 experiments across the world. And in every single one of those experiments of justice system strengthening, outside evaluators were able to document a 50 to 85% reduction in slavery or violence against women or children. And so this was the big epiphany. This was like, oh my goodness. It actually turns out most of this violence will go away if the government does just even a decent job of enforcing the law and providing services to survivors. And it turns out that you can measure whether it's working or not. It turns out that the power of survivors to not only be recovering life and strength, but then leading the effort to bring transformation. That's incredibly powerful. But then also the strength of these local teams that IJM had invested in over a couple of decades, they could actually reduce slavery and violence by between 50 and 85%. And they could do it in a time period that ran between 4 and 8 years. So the big thing there, Mark, is sort of the analogy in the Gospels, where the farmer plowing in the field stumbles upon a treasure, and then he understands the value of what he's found so much that he sells everything to secure the land. And that's what has happened to us. We saw, oh my goodness, in the second decade, we've actually worked out a replicable model for how you strengthen a local justice system so that the poorest don't have to be terrified by slavery and violence against women and children. So the amazing thing now, Mark, is that we've identified 46 more places around the world that have been pre-qualified in that sense, right? They have high rates of poverty, also very high rates of slavery or violence against women and children, but they also have a justice system that could be strengthened so that most of that slavery and violence goes away. So in the next 7 or 8 years, we believe we will be able to bring practical protection, that is a reduction of slavery or violence of between 50 and 85%, to 500 million people in poverty who are vulnerable to these kinds of abuses.
Who've never had that kind of protection. Like it doesn't
correct.
exist. It never has existed.
No, these communities would have never had a reasonably functioning law enforcement system that actually protected them from the most obvious forms of violence.
500 million people. Extraordinary. And then there's more that are going to be rescued.
Correct.
And that's 1 million, I believe, is our target.
Well, we're targeting by 2030.
Yes.
We can actually bring individual freedom to 1 million people who are either in slavery or are being in places right now of violent assault and abuse. And by the year 2030, we think 1 million can be brought out of those situations and be given freedom from that violence. And then 300 million of that total 500 million can know that protection by the year 2030. Within just 5 years, 1 million people can know freedom from the individual justice that is brought to bear for them, and 300 million who would otherwise be vulnerable to that kind of violence can just no longer live in terror that they will be abused that way. So this is totally unexpected as an expectation for us. We had no idea when we started, number one, that you could actually bring effective rescue. Okay, so it turned out God was still in that business. Secondly, we had no idea you could actually transform a justice system so that it worked reasonably well when it had a history of nothing but brokenness or corruption. Well, it turns out God's still in that business as well. And we just now have identified places where this solution, through the courage and incredibly nation-changing work of our teams, could actually be possible. I would also emphasize that these are local teams, right? So you don't, you don't picture me and you going into these places and like saving a local justice system. It's Kenyans in Kenya, it's Bangladeshis in Bangladesh, it's Cambodians in Cambodia who form these IJM teams, and they are working to strengthen their own justice system so it just simply delivers for their most vulnerable citizens.
Take us a bit more into the survivor network, because one of the great things that could have been imagined but not yet really evident when you first began was how significant survivors would become to the actual work of IJM, that they actually are these leaders who, in their own context, with their own understanding, with their own skills and commitment, and obviously their experience of suffering and trauma, have brought to bear so much. I just wonder if you could tell maybe a couple of stories of survivor leaders that are really leading the way in their own nation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose if I'd been more sensitive to history, I would have been able to see, the great change, the great leaders of social change, and so many times have been those who've been hurt by these systems or habits of abuse and violence,
Yes.
and that they have been the ones who've led change. Frederick Douglass being the most obvious one here in the United States during the abolitionist era. But you could give examples over and over, and that's what we have discovered, that if you do bring rescue, as we have through the casework, to tens of thousands of individuals, there's going to be within those tens of thousands leaders of extraordinary talent, courage, capability, leadership. And so now we actually have lawyers, social workers, um, leaders in government who were survivors brought into freedom through IJM rescue operations a couple decades ago. But now they are maybe elected officials. Maybe they actually are leaders of social work ministries. And what they're also is there are now thousands of them who are actually advocates, who we have seen so many times that one of the biggest problems is for people to even care about these issues, that feel so intractable, that feel so hopeless. So those are the two things. Either you don't care about it, or you care about it but you think it's hopeless. And then a survivor gets up and they say, look what happened to me. How can you no longer care about that? Now, I've heard them make those presentations to police officers and to others who were very neglectful of these abuses, and they cease to neglect it after they've had that conversation with a real human being. But secondly, if now you care, you can no longer think that it's hopeless, because that survivor will say, I'm not hopeless. Look what I've seen, and look what become of my life.
Right.
So I was just thinking of one leader, Pachyama in South Asia, where she was held in slavery in a brick factory for years and years, suffering horrific abuse there, and her children were. As part of an IJM rescue operation, she was brought out, and then she helped form the Release Bonded Laborers Association, which has thousands of members and has rescued hundreds of others from slavery. And she's able to go to the authorities, and she immediately has the doors open to her because of the authenticity of her voice, the way the community is behind her. And I could name continent after continent where the people who are leading the transformation are the survivor leaders themselves. And one of the things you would also, so many of them will give testimony to, is that God saw them in their darkness, and they will testify to the goodness of an almighty God who loved them and brought about a transformation they could never have dreamed of. So I see these survivor leaders. They may be the most powerful thing that has come out of IJM over the long haul, is the thousands upon thousands of survivor leaders.
Another thing is that naturally there's been violence perpetrated against IJM at various places. And one of the places that lives on, rightly so, as one of the major points of violence against IJM happened in Kenya. And it was the story first of the violence, but then it was the story also of the resilience of IJM and local indigenous people from Kenya doing the work of laying out the legal case, which in this case was really against police. But tell us that story.
Yeah, so IJM early on in Kenya, maybe 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, started doing cases of police abuse of power. Because imagine, if you're going to stop violence against the poor, who has the power to do that? It has to be local law enforcement, it has to be local police. But what if the police are themselves the abusers? And this is what the prophets in the Old Testament were hitting upon relentlessly with the rulers, is not only are you failing in your godly call to protect the poor, but you're the ones who are abusing them.
Right.
So you can't have transformation unless the police transform from being the predators to being the protectors. And in Kenya, this has been particularly a difficult challenge. And as you pointed out, IJM has a team there, and still does, that's working on individual cases. And in this particular case, there was a taxi driver, this is so common, where he was being extorted by local police to cough up money by the local police. And he had resisted this and had been shot, but then had survived. And then he came to IJM because he wanted to have justice brought against these rogue police officers who had injured him. And so indeed, IJM took up his case and of Josephat, a taxi driver who had been shot. Well, as IJM was in the midst of pursuing prosecution in that case, Willie Kamani was the IJM lawyer leading it. And when Willie Kamani and Josephat and their driver Joseph were departing from that courthouse on that bright day, they were abducted by the very police who they were seeking to prosecute, and they were actually taken out into a rural area, and that night were tortured and murdered. And IJM found their bodies in bags in a river. And that was just an extreme case of what IJM staff had encountered over the decades of being kidnapped, being assaulted, being brutalized by violent criminals. But in this case, they actually lost their lives. Now, imagine you're on that team. You have been fighting against the police abuse of power. And in the process, now the police have demonstrated they're willing to come after you.
Right.
They're willing to kill you and do that in broad daylight. How confident are they that they can totally get away with this with impunity? And so don't you have to think yourself, well, maybe we've just taken up the wrong fight here as a local team. Maybe we should ratchet this down. Maybe we should fold up our tent, because are we ready to go to war against police who are now willing to just murder us? And I will tell you that there was not a single member of that Kenya team who walked away from that fight to not only seek justice for their colleague Willie and those others who were murdered, but then to actually accelerate that fight. And it took 6 years for them to actually secure conviction, which they eventually did, of the 5 police officers who committed that abuse, which was miraculous and thought to be impossible at the time. But over those years, they have seen scores of successful prosecutions against police officers that we had spent 20 years pursuing and had never seen. But because of in many respects, the martyrdom of these IJM leaders and of their total refusal to go away, Kenya right now is in a transformation in the accountability that is brought to their policing, because there's a new generation of Kenyans that wants to build a better future for their children.
Right. I do think one of the things that is the most remarkable to watch is what you've just illustrated through that story, which is the resilience of IJM people in continuing to pursue this when, even in this case, they themselves are actually at high personal risk, and where giving up would have been so understandable based on this irony of already being engaged in police abuse, and then to have it turned against them, and then to persist for 6 years in being able to secure the full accountability. It's a really remarkable story, and it's a story of resilient character, the deep furrowing character of this kind of work in general, and in that particular case. Years and years ago, right, as I was getting to know you and starting my time connected to IJM, I remember you're referring me to the biography of William Garrison. And one of the things about his story is that he was in some ways the American version of Wilberforce. And from his very first broadsheet declaring the immediate end of slavery, calling for the immediate end of slavery in the United States, which would take 58 years to bring about. And I just was so stunned. And the reason I'm bringing it up right now is that for listeners who are wondering and thinking, this is really IJM's story, this is the work that they are doing. First, of course, we have ways ourselves of being able to support them in prayer and otherwise. But in addition to that, I hope that you are as moved as I have been moved over the decades to imagine a deep furrowing work of justice that could take decades to accomplish, and which is a burden that is worthy of such sacrifice. And I guess I'm just wondering at this stage, Gary, as you anticipate these next 5 years with a potential prayerful plan for seeing 1 million released from slavery and 300 million for the first time ever protected by the rule of law, What does resilience look like now in leading IJM?
Well, I think first of all, it's hyper clarity about who is actually responsible for the outcome of these aspirations. Like that is something that God alone could actually carry out. So what we can do at IJM is try to be faithful every day in the earnest, excellent deployment of our gifts and plans and capabilities. But whether or not a million people actually do find freedom and whether 300 million actually find themselves living in safety and protection, that's a miracle that God is going to bring about. And so
Right.
we just cannot bear the weight or the burden of that. And so this constant process of saying almost daily to each other, oh, that's the weight that God is bearing. I'm doing my little job today, um, and I'm happy and grateful that God would actually include my little contribution today. But being hyper clear about who is bearing the true weight
Right.
of doing
Right.
justice in the world, this is God's.
God's resilience.
And and I do think that this is a first to observe. I don't think you can find any worthwhile struggle of justice in the world that went fast. So if you're in the justice business, just mean it's a marathon and not a sprint. Okay, that's helpful clarity. It's so helpful if you're starting a run to know, is this a marathon or is this a sprint? This, if it's a work of justice, is a marathon. And in this era, I just think what the world is aching to see is the followers of Jesus who have a incandescent freedom from fear and a life-giving joy. And that is what I find to be the miracle of IJM's teams around the world, is
Yes.
that they are finding on a daily basis by the gift of God a freedom from fear. And they are also living in a life-giving joy that is just so surprising. So the greatest miracle of IJM is not even these results that feel miraculous to us. The miracle is they've done it for a long time, and they've done it with a spirit of joy and a freedom from fear that is, I think, just supernatural.
It is really remarkable. And I can only testify over these decades how visible, frequent, common, when I'm together with quantities of IJM staff in this or that or the other setting, joy, laughter, celebration, love, great love for one another, a capacity of being on a shared road, like a warrior can have with other warriors who are sharing in the battle that's really at hand. But it's a battle for justice, a battle done out of love, a battle done out of a keen sense of professional commitment. But greater than that, this larger sense of spiritual dependency and community. It really is quite a stunning thing to me. Gary, when you face the challenges and just think of the horizon, like the million freed and the 300 million protected, and you think of the goal beyond that you've mentioned, the 500 million that IGM is really aiming for, and then you look at the landscape of all the other challenging things that are going on in the world, how do you keep your own framework about staying as focused as you are and as disciplined as you and IGM are in being able to do your task when really it feels like all hell is breaking loose in so many different places?
Sure. I think part of it is, when we gathered in for our 20th anniversary 8 years ago now, and we thought about the path forward, we did try to think, well, what's something that we can encourage each other with, like almost every day, because this is going to be a long walk. And it was this idea that protecting the poor from violence is God's weight, but it's our work, and we're going to seek to do it Jesus's way. And what that was affirming is what we already mentioned was the burden of whether all this activity that we're doing actually works or not. That's God's weight. The protection of the poor from violence is the work of his kingdom that he must miraculously bring about, but it is our work. And that is that, in that sense, maybe our sense of calling is this particular one. there's massive endeavors of seeking justice in the world, but what we feel called to in this moment is strengthening justice systems so they'll protect the poorest from violence. And I think there is a sense of peace and contentment and confidence in this is what we think God has given us to do in this era. Now, hopefully, we are keeping our heart and mind open to whatever calling He also may bring before us, but we're going to really test that calling in very unanxious conversation and engagement with Him, not a running after like the next like breathless piece of urgent news or of need, because that would be just a sort of hamster wheel I just don't think we can keep up with. But so the idea is, okay, the larger burden of the world for all of its brokenness and redemption and need of redemption, that's God's weight. What is our work? And whatever our work is, let's do it Jesus's way. What was Jesus's way? It was staying close to the Father and loving each other. So I think the simplicity of that, of not trying to bear all of the burdens of the world's brokenness and actually affirmatively throwing it off our shoulders because it will crush us and immobilize us. Okay, throw that off today. Let's do our piece of work and let's just stay close to the Father and love each other and see if that doesn't do pretty well for the day.
So easily said, but so not easily practiced. And
Fair.
I do think, again, one of the things that is an expression of your leadership and the gift of the Holy Spirit is the culture within IJM that has been able to sustain and live what you just described. So I'm just here to bear witness that while no organization is perfect and blah, 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 when you have contact with IJM and you are close to what it is that's going on, what you've just said actually is the spirit. It actually is the practice. It actually is the way that people own the mission. And I just have to say, Gary, that when the history of IJM is written, the significance of God's call on your own personal life as a leader, the significance of your own mental and emotional health, your own capacity to live in that same freedom and joy is something that really has been passed on and which allows IGM to do this otherwise completely crushing, devastatingly challenging work would simply not have been possible. It would have imploded under its own weight of the burden. And the distinction that you've drawn isn't just clearly articulated, it's actually clearly lived, I think, in the way IJM tries to enact this around the world, not just in the United States, but all around the globe. And the people that we've been talking about is staff, and particularly survivor staff, but staff period, and so many people that have joined this in a way longing for both justice, longing for God in the midst of injustice, and bringing these things together as a community around the world now is really just a quintessentially beautiful thing.
And I would say, from in my experience of it, what's so vivid to me is practices of prayer.
Yeah.
First of all, just the way I'm so inclined to get so busy without talking to God about the God work I'm supposed to be doing. No, it's like, so it's actually talking to Him about what we're doing together. Secondly, it's community of not doing this in any lone ranger manner at all, but oh my goodness, because I'm weak certain days, and then maybe I'm stronger for my brother or sister another, and they are for me, and that back and forth. And then thirdly, Mark, the connection to the global body of Christ.
Yes.
Like the courage, the joy, the beauty, amazingness of followers of Jesus all around the world, and the way that has nurtured my life and our life together.
Yes.
I do absolutely believe that, especially to the extent the American church is in some ways just not really integrated with the global body of Christ, they are really impoverishing themselves of the just great oxygen that God would want us to be breathing of joy and strength around the world.
Well, I think that's exactly right. You and I were just recently at an iJam event where many people from around the world were present who are exemplars of just what you're describing. And the way in which their own humanity, the groundedness of them as human beings, the groundedness of them in community in their own national settings, wherever that was around the world, the groundedness in iJam's culture, the capacity to move into for them, a foreign context, like coming to the United States for this event, all of that is sewn together through this gift of God's grace and presence that has just been so beautifully manifest and is so beautifully manifest. Again, I don't want to go on at an extreme level that sounds like we're describing some fictional organization or a balloon that's about to be popped. It's just really actually not like that. It doesn't feel like that. It doesn't taste like that. It's like, no, this is actually real on the ground reality of a heavenly gift that lands in ordinary space, and especially it lands in places of some of the greatest darkness and suffering on the planet. It's just an amazing thing.
And you and I have had these experiences, right? Of going and seeing what God's people are doing around the world in all kinds of places and settings that you would hear nothing about until until Nick Kristof writes about it or something. And then you have an insight into, oh my goodness, God is doing relentlessly beautiful and joyful and powerful things in the world. Um, and I think you and I are just both the very personal beneficiaries of that exposure and life experience. And when you have that experience, as you say, it's all normal people, right? It's not, and that's the beauty of it, right? It really is
Right.
this incarnation of the living God in normal humans,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very refreshing and life giving to just drink from that very deep well.
Mm-hmm. Gary, is there anything that is on your horizon, like, for example, in the second decade, where you're gradually trying to understand what systems and public justice system building might require, and the need then to ultimately, finally, and fully, totally embrace that and understand what an incredibly important next step it was for iJam? Is there anything on your horizon that is an equivalent kind of, if and when it was ever possible that we could do X? If so, what would that be? What would that third step from the individuals and the rescues to the building of public justice systems? Is there some further entity problematic horizon legal step that you could imagine?
I do just think that even when we move to what will mostly be demonstration projects as to what's possible,
Right.
um, these will be very large communities of millions, even tens of millions in these jurisdictions who will get to experience something totally different for the first time. But then it will be a nurturing of a whole generation of leaders who secure that transformation for the long haul and build a future for their children. So it's the sustainability
Mm-hmm.
of the transformation,
Yes.
and that will be the really vigorous and strenuous work that will go on. In many respects, um, these are jurisdictions that are looking to build a functionality that the United States maybe has had for maybe 75 years of, of basic functionality. But does anybody think that the justice system in the United States is in its perfected form that no one needs to pay any attention to? No, of course not. These are systems of power, in which humans are always going to be tempted to misuse them or to neglect them. And so there will be in every one of these settings, maybe going back to Martin Luther King's language, this is an initial act, even the transformation of the Jericho Road, because there's going to be a constant onslaught for control over these territories, and a generation will need to lead that. The
Yes.
second thing is that technology is going to take oppression of the poor and the vulnerable to whole new levels that are sometimes even hard to imagine. Two come to mind right now. Right now, there's a massive business of live stream child abuse where a usually a man in the United States or in Paris or in Russia somewhere will be paying to direct the live stream abuse of a child in the Philippines, for instance. In 1 year, in the year 2022, there were 500,000 children abused in front of a webcam in the Philippines alone for customers around the world. So think about that for a moment, of a morphing of a monetizing child abuse globally. Now you also have forced scamming. This is another phenomenon that, all those phishing emails we get and texts and stuff. It turns out that a huge proportion of them are coming from compounds, largely in Southeast Asia, of tens of thousands of people who are held as slaves in compounds in front of computers. And they have to meet quotas every day of scamming to the world, because now the market, you don't just have to rob from your neighbor, you can rob from the world. These are all the kinds of crimes that are going to continue to assault the vulnerable, because criminals go after the weakest. And so there will be not only a fight for sustainable gains within justice systems, but then taking on the new forms of evil that are emerging. So I would just say what's deepest is maybe what we've been talking about is what will help humans and the followers of Jesus to actually continually embark in the witness that they will need to take for justice in whatever world emerges. And that's why I think these communities of spiritual formation are going to be the places where we're going to find the humans who are most equipped and prepared to carry on this ministry of the gospel and of the kingdom of Christ into whatever darkness emerges on the horizon.
Amen, amen. I just give such thanks to God for you, Gary, personally, and for your leadership of IJM, and to the IJM staff and team, for the board, for all the donors that make it possible. It's an extraordinary manifestation of God's grace in the world. And I am very thankful for this conversation and a chance to just remind people that IJM is not only alive and well, but doing yet more extraordinary work. And I give God thanks. Thank you for sharing all you have today.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.